So this is going to be the last and the sixth section of vernal pool communities. Um, Now we are going to talk about the four-toed salamander. Also, the scientific name is Hemidactylium scutatum. Um, so their distribution range includes, it's pretty broad. It includes as north as Nova Scotia to the northern Minnesota, and then the southward range goes as far as Gulf of Mexico. So within this entire this geography, its range is rather discontinuous. It's patchy, um, so limited to isolated populations, particularly in the Great Plains states and in the southern states. Um, their occurrence is rather patchy, isolated, and discontinuous. Um, but within the Appalachian range, their occurrence is rather continuous. Probably the reason is in the Appalachian range along the Appalachian Mountains, there's continuous forests. Um, in the New England, it's believed to be at least in historically continuous, but the current evidence do not support that they're as continuous as they used to be, even in New England. Maybe in the northern New England, they are rather continuous, but in the southern New England, where you have more development, their presence is rather patchy as well. Mm. Their suitable breeding grounds, the way they pick their breeding grounds actually make them habitat specialists. So they only pick breeding ponds like vernal pools or certain or similar ephemeral marsh-like habitats that are embedded within large, extensive, mature mesic or wet forests with a very dense, thick canopy cover. That actually helps them to preserve their body moisture, which is extremely important for the adult survival as well as egg survival. And their breeding activities are also dependent on not just breeding activities and foraging activities are dependent on presence of abundant amounts of um, downed woody debris, particularly including those that are large woody debris that are also older, right? So with um, higher decaying classes. The nesting habitat is also cool. They don't necessarily nest in the vernal pool. They actually nest underneath the sphagnum moss or the sedges that are located around vernal pools and small ephemeral stream habitats. They mate in late summer all the way up to fall, and then female can actually store the sperms as the sperm pack, and then spring the fertilization happens, and then she deposits the eggs underneath the sphagnum mats. And many females could lay eggs in the same nest, but one of the females, like you see in the photograph, the bottom photograph, guard the eggs. um, And once the eggs hatch, larvae is not that far away from the pond. So the larvae jumps into the pond, takes about 6 weeks to complete the larval development. Um, and they're listed as threatened or endangered in Great Plains states, particularly the Midwestern states, multiple Midwestern states, not so in the New England environments. Um, So in those areas where they are declining, the conservation strategies include providing or addition of downed mature large woody debris into mature old growth forests, um, and construction of shallow vernal pools um, within those mature woodlands, mature mesic woodlands and forests, and creating kind of engineering those wetlands with raised hummocks, um, so that that hummock itself will facilitate establishment and growth of sphagnum mosses and sedges that will recruit species for reproduction. Um, it's kind of really cool species. It's among one of those salamanders that you can argue as a habitat specialist on many other fronts. And also, certain studies also indicate that continuity forests are also important for them. Like earlier I mentioned, their habitats tend to be their populations tends to be patchy and fragmented in within most of their ranges. The reason is actually lack of continuity of forests. So forest continuity, having corridors that connecting different vernal pools, different aquatic and wetland habitats, are quite important to boost of their meta populations. So if you're looking at the map to the left, it shows a reasonably good map of the species distribution. So if you look at certain Great Lakes states, or in the Great Lakes ecoregion, um, you do actually see this patchy distribution. Some of the Great Plains states towards the southern end of the Great Plains, again, you have evidence for this patchy distribution. Um, and also in the southeastern environment, particularly within Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, at least the southern Alabama, you do see this patchy distribution. Um, so in this image, it appears the northeastern part, at least within the southern New England, the distribution to be continuous, but current evidence that we have from those statewide databases doesn't necessarily support it. So I don't know whether lack of information is due to inadequate surveys, because those are largely subfossorial and fossorial species, or is it because they're actually declining? So in spots that you find one or two individuals, you're going to actually find more individuals. So they are locally abundant, but rare across their geography. So it's a really interesting species. What's happening within its population dynamics makes it really interesting. If now the big photograph to the right, top right, we are looking at those developing embryos that are laid underneath the sphagnum mosses on the land, not in water. It's pretty cool photograph that you see over there. The bottom photograph is actually a larvae that hatches from the egg, jumps right into the vernal pool, and completes its short larval stage. Um, the next two photograph, actually, the one right, kind of overlapping the map, uh, you can see that hummock-like environment, right? That is the fern growing, right, and then right underneath the fern, you actually see sphagnum moss. So it's this kind of hummock-like environments that the females are using for nesting, right? And you can see that orange arrow. That is a point that's actually kind of an indication where the egg laying happens. And if you zoom into that particular sphagnum moss area, you see the actual nest, and in the photograph right next to it, you do see several eggs laid over there. So actually, restoring that kind of like prominent hummock-like terrestrial habitats, kind of land islands within wetlands, within vernal pools, within ephemeral streams, and other ephemeral wetland habitats actually help recruit this particular unique species. Now, let me talk to you about obligatory versus facultative vernal pool indicator species. Obligatory species are the species that primarily or exclusively breed in vernal pool habitats. Facultative vernal pool indicator species are species that can occupy in vernal pools but also are known to successfully complete their life cycle in habitats outside vernal pools. Starting from the first one, wood frog, that's the top left image, obligatory. And then so these guys tend to occupy largely forested vernal pools, and we talked about that particular species ecology earlier. And then the bottom top image, that is a marble salamander, again have been found very commonly, not, I should not say common, they tend to occur or primarily breed in forested wetlands, forested vernal pools. um, the last one on the top row, that is maybe salamander. Now that guy is also a vernal pool occupant, particularly in vernal pool habitats or similar ephemeral wetland habitats found within pine woodlands and cypress tupido swamp or bottomland type habitats. Now to the bottom row, The guy on the left, that is eastern spadefoot toad, right? It's a very rare and a state protected species, and in fact, that particular species is much more common in the southeastern part of its distribution, right? I don't think any of the states list that particular species as rare, and they occur in multiple habitat types, and you could even find that in a home garden. But in the northeastern environments, right, particularly New York, Pennsylvania, and anything north of that environment, um, eastern spadefoot toad becomes extremely rare. Their populations are declining. Their breeding habitats are they tend to breed less than they used to, or so the known breeding sites, active breeding sites, are declining by the year, and there are several reintroduction programs and conservation action plans going on for that particular species. It's a really interesting species because its activity period is quite limited, at least in the Northeast. It's fairly limited to certain part of the summer. Um, Again, a primary or an obligatory vernal pool breeding species. And its breeding activity starts way late in the night. Probably in vernal pool environments, that would be the species that emit reproductive calls the very last. Um, in Massachusetts, their occurrence, their presence is restricted to Cape Cod, and their strongest or historically known population occurs in the Cape Cod environment within the sand dunes and the pine barren ecoregion. It's really interesting because those vernal pools in the pine barrens do not have much hydro period. The hydro period is extremely short. Interestingly, this particular species also finishes its larval stage in matter of 2 weeks. Right, within 2 weeks they are done. And in fact, you also know that the pine barren systems or the vernal pools they breed in is not that far away from coastal waters. So um, apparently these species are also quite tolerant of saltwater conditions. In certain anecdotal studies, it has shown that they do survive certain levels of salinity and even complete metamorphosis, as much as a non-saline vernal pool would do. Um, and um, that's it's oh, although it's called an eastern spadefoot toad, it's not a toad, right? It's actually an anuran. It has its own family. Um, Moving on, the next salamander, the middle one, in the bottom corner, that is actually the Jeffersonian salamander. The blue spotted salamander is much more similar to that one too. And in fact, the blue spotted and Jeffersonian salamanders, both of them are threatened or rare, very rare in Massachusetts, and they actually tend to interbreed, um, crossbreed. So it's kind of creates an interesting scenario. Like, what do you do when rare species interbreed? The last one is the spotted salamander. So in fact, all of these species that you're looking at are actually vernal pool obligatory species. Now let's talk about some of those obligatory species that can occupy vernal pool habitats, um, but that's not the only habitat they can utilize. So this includes spring peepers, great tree frog, um, leopard frog, pickerel frog, um, American toad, Fowler's toad, um, and then many species of turtles, right? There is not a single species of turtle that occupy vernal pools as a or occur only in vernal pool habitats. I have picked a spotted turtle as an example because among all the turtles, spotted turtles are known to occupy vernal pools more than any other turtle. But I have even seen like really small snapping turtles and painted turtles in vernal pool environment as well, and the same has been documented by other field biologists. So these guys, again, what I want to emphasize is their life history completion is not strictly dependent on vernal pools. And some of these species, for example, what is not listed over here are actually green frogs and bullfrogs. So those guys actually also occur in vernal pool habitats, but their purpose of visiting vernal pool habitats is feeding, right? Other ones like spring peepers, toads, American and Fowler's toad, great tree frog, pickerel and Fowler's frog, they actually visit vernal pools for breeding, right? Because they also have a shorter larval life cycle. But species like bullfrogs and green frogs that have actually larval stages that are longer than a year or multiple years, um, their purpose of visiting vernal pools is not breeding, it is rather a thermoregulation or seeking refuge or hunting or feeding for the most of the time. So now we're looking at few of these species that can also found within vernal pools. And some of these are actually like transient species, but I just wanted to mention about those, even they are transient. One of the example is this spotted turtle. So spotted turtle's distribution in North America is quite broad along the latitudes, right? The southernmost distribution goes as south as Florida, um, way even into the northernmost part of southern Florida, almost all the way up to central Florida, and then the northernmost distribution, well, at least along the eastern coast, it goes as far as central Maine. But if you look at the Great Lakes area, where you have another population, they also occur um, parts of southern Canada as well. But they do not their range do not extend that far down um, into other Midwestern or Great Plains states. So in terms of that's their distribution range, right? So it's do not misunderstand simply because a distribution range of the species being so wide that they are doing fine. In several Midwestern states, are considering it as a species of special concern. In Massachusetts, up until fairly recently, they were considered as a species of conservation concern. Um, the problem is that these particular turtle, particularly this guy, more than it's been actually rare, it's hard to find. Its surface activity is quite limited to a very short time frame, and then after that they all hunker down. They all start estivating. Um, so it kind of make conservation really hard because of that. Certain species are actually rare, but some species are not rare, but it's hard to survey them, detect them by conventional survey methods. Um, and this particular species, have a sexual dimorphism, meaning the male and female are different. Well, which is kind of the case for most of the turtles, particularly um, freshwater turtles. You can tell them apart by looking into their tail. Males have much more fatter, thicker tail, where the vent is way down in the tail, and the females have much more smaller, thinner tail, and the vent is way up. Mm. Now, that aside, in this slide, the top right image, that's actually a female spotted turtle. You can see she has like an orange pinkish face. The bottom image is actually, well, not the hatchling one, the one that's right next to the hatchling is actually a male. You can see his face is much more browner or gray in coloration. And the spot distribution in these guys are actually kind of an individual fingerprint. The number of spots do not change very much at all. As a juvenile, as a hatchling, you may not have a very prominent spotting pattern, but as they mature, within a couple of years, you can actually within the early few years, the spotting pattern becomes permanent. Um, the spots are usually yellow in coloration. In juveniles, you might see different types of colorations. Some of them could be white, some of them could be orange, some of them could be red, some of them could be yellow. Um, but currently, we are doing a study documenting the vernal pool, documenting the occupancy of spotted turtles in different wetland habitats. And actually, in terms of an identification tag, we are using the spot distribution. Um, and we do have recovered the same individual multiple times in our survey already. Um, and the spot coloration in adults sometimes change based on what's present in the environment, because some of the dissolved ions like ferric, slash ferrous or tannins can actually get absorbed into the shell and kind of stain those spots. Um, so the spot coloration can vary, but the spot pattern, number of spots in adults or subadults will not vary. So let's talk about some biological features of spotted turtles. Um, they do occupy a wide range of wetland habitats, bogs, um, marshlands, swamps, different types of swamps, sedge meadows, wet meadows, mesite prairies, slow flowing woodland streams. Particularly, they use these stream or channel like habitats for migration and movements, brooks, um, permanent and seasonal ponds, and they crisscross, they move across the land for the purpose of nesting. They are known to migrate or move up to over 500 meters on land in search of suitable nesting habitats. For hibernation, they are even known to migrate up to over 200 meters. The average home range could be also highly variable from a half an hectare to over 50 hectares. Um, so during the active period, they could spend about 2 to 4 months in vernal pools or similar ephemeral wetlands for the purpose of feeding. Um, During winter, they hibernate most often communally as multiple individuals on the muddy bottoms of shallow wetlands or slow flowing waterways. Um, so the courtship, for the purpose of mating, immediately upon finishing their winter dormancy, they emerge and they copulate in shallow waters, underwater, where male actually chases the female. That's kind of the courtship behavior, and often the male starts kind of nipping on the female's legs and around the shell margins. And multiple males could fight um, in the presence of females. There are several publications that actually describe how this mating ritual happens. So the mating ritual, or rather, not the mating ritual itself, this male-male combats can happen at the surface water. And in terms of breeding, so throughout the breeding happens throughout the active season, can happen throughout the active season. The peak breeding happens in late May to early June. Females can sperm, can store the sperms, and then nesting happens around late June, during the nights in upland environments. Um, the clutch size is between 2 to 7. They are deposited in nests that are constructed or dug in the sand or soft sediments, um, and usually on sunny locations where the temperature will be mediated, that is necessary for the growth of the embryos. So within the northern distribution range, they produce a single female produce like a single clutch per year, and but in the southern range they do produce a lot more clutches, about 3 clutches per year. The incubation period, um, or the time it takes for eggs to hatch, could be as much as somewhere between 2 to 3 months. Well, mostly less than 3 months, but more than 2 months. Development could be faster at higher temperatures, meaning in the southern range they could actually hatch faster. Young emerge around August or September, um, and those young can actually immediately overwinter. And during summer too, they can estivate in the muddy bottom of waterways or wetlands, and sometimes they even like use muskrat burrows for the purpose of estivation in hot summer. So they because of this nature, their activities are fairly limited to this, like late spring and early summer period. Um, so 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 they can actually remain dormant or inactive or estivate the entire summer and become briefly active during October November period sometimes, um, and then again undergo winter dormancy. So they could actually remain dormant in multiple times in the year. Their lifespans are quite variable. In the literature, it says about 65 years to 110 for males. It's really surprising that a freshwater turtle living that long. Now let's talk about blanding turtles, another gorgeous turtle. So these guys have actually kind of have two different distribution ranges. There's a one larger, more extensive population in the Great Lakes ecoregion that also extends into parts of the northern Great Plains. Now that population is relatively robust, but there are conservation efforts going on even in some of those Midwestern states to protect these particular species, since some of the local populations are undergoing declining. Now, if you look at the northeastern coast, you see several populations. There's one along the that population is much smaller, much fragmented. There's one around New York, there's another in southern New England area, and another in Canada. So those populations are fragmented, right? Even within the southern New England, that population that crosses Massachusetts and Vermont, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, that's actually fairly fragmented. Goes slightly creeping up into Maine. Now, those populations, that's not even continuous, that is quite patchy. And some of those populations have been boosted by reintroductions. So the New England populations are actually more in trouble than the Midwestern populations. And I am actually involved with one of the projects that includes head starting these turtles, which actually incorporates visiting certain known robust populations. Um, and we actually, for that purpose, we catch females with the use of traps or manually when they're migrating over the land. We put a radio collar on them, and then we keep actually tracking them until they lay eggs. Once they lay eggs, we dig out the eggs. We take the eggs to a hatchery, a laboratory, and then we let the eggs hatch, and then we actually um, rear the hatchlings up to about 8 to 9 months and release them after the summer. So that the reason we are doing that is actually we have figured that for most of the turtles, the mortality occurs in the juvenile stage, as hatchlings. So by um, rearing them in situ, we ensure a greater hatching success as well as a greater success of hatchling survival. And after we release them back, we still keep a track on them. And we do realize that their post hatchling survival or post release survival is greater than 95%, at least for the populations we have been monitoring. So they're really cool species, and conservation works because the conservation efforts that we have been doing have helped this particular species to do better. We might have a stronger population in few years back in New England, at least. So let's talk about some biology of landing turtles. These are omnivores. I mean, most of the turtles are actually omnivores. And in fact, some turtles, particularly painted turtle, I'm not going to talk about them right now. Painted turtle are really cool because they play a significant role in seed dispersal and propagular dispersal because they do ingest plant material as well. So these guys eat crayfish and many other, even they're also known to ingest small mammals like aquatic or semi-aquatic rodents and amphibians and and plants and particularly seeds. I haven't studied these turtles doing seed dispersal, but I know through a collaborative study that painted turtles do contribute significantly for seed dispersal. Mating in blanding turtles happens between April through November, so that's a fairly broad um, time frame for a northern distributed for a species that is distributed only within a northern latitudes. Um, and within a given population, only half, or actually less than half, of females actually actively reproduce. So this is actually a really cool fact regarding most of the freshwater turtles. Not every reproductively mature female perform reproduction. They are known to forego sexual reproduction between two successive between two egg laying seasons. To and then they are nest laying. For nest laying, they do migrate quite far from the wetland habitats and known to select loamy um, sand gravel mixed loamy soil for laying eggs. And per clutch, they could produce to 15 to 17 eggs, and known to live up to 60 years. But certain studies suggest they could live up to 100. That is more likely in captive environments rather than in the nature. Um, their association of vernal pools is limited to foraging. Their overwintering happens in larger wetlands, permanent wetlands, um, and they spend most of their time in other larger lakes and ponds and highly vegetated wetland environments, which includes marshes, large ponds or medium-sized ponds, bogs. Particularly areas that has a dense vegetation. And the ponds that they occupy tends to have little woody vegetation, but lots of other soft stemmed vegetation. So generally, the canopy cover around the ponds they occupy could be fairly open. Known to travel up to 1 kilometers for the purpose of breeding, finding mates, and for the purpose of laying eggs or constructing nests. Home range could be between somewhere like zero point 0.6 to nearly 8 hectares. Um, in suburban environments, they actually could have much more expensive home ranges, as much as 22 hectares, because the reason is in suburban or developed environments they have to occupy a larger home range or associate a larger surface area, in order to access different types of habitats to satisfy their life history needs. Um, in larger open water environments, in fact, the male home range could be much larger than females, right? You can see in the example, males could have actually a home range up to 60 hectares, where females usually have less than 20 hectares in open large water bodies. Um, but older females tends to have a greater home range than younger females, and in fact older females produce a lot more eggs than younger females, and the post hatchling rate of older females are always more successful than younger females. And there is no evidence for territoriality among this particular species. um, there's evidence for multiple paternity, so meaning a single female could mate with multiple males and use all of those sperms to fertilize her eggs. Um, and so there is some sort of a polyandry situation there, where females tend to mate with more than one male in a given season in a single reproductive effort. Female lay eggs once a year, but not predictably every year. They can, but they may not necessarily do so. Um, and that reproductive season spans from late June to early July. Again, like many other turtle species, the females can store sperms, and the nesting happens nocturnally during the night time. Again, a characteristic that you observe in many other turtle species. Um, I have observed certain spotted turtles searching for nesting sites during daytime, but not necessarily laying eggs. Pretty interesting. And it could be, it could take as many as 10 days to complete egg oviposition and nest construction. And the nest fidelity rate could be high, meaning a certain female may repeatedly return to the same site to construct her nests. Probably because if particular nesting site renders high success and nest survival, it perfectly makes sense for the female to return over and over to the same site.